In the Middle Ages and even before that, women were punished in truly shocking ways, often for things that were actually completely harmless. Today, we'll show you these cruel old measures, and we'll start right away with the punishment that, quite literally, took away women's speech. This was the so-called scolds bridle, a particularly insidious form of a shame mask. In 16th century England, it was sometimes enough for a woman to speak too loudly or too critically to be declared a scold. As punishment, women had an iron cage forced over their heads, often with a metal tongue inside that pressed down their own tongue and made speaking almost impossible. In some cases, there was even a gag fitted with a metal plate covered in spikes, meant to literally hold the tongue in check. To make matters worse, the woman was then paraded through the streets in front of everyone, put on display, and publicly humiliated. Next comes a slightly more modern punishment, but one no less cruel, the so-called ugly carnival. But what exactly does that mean? We move to the time of the Second World War, more precisely to the period after the war, when occupied France was free again, and many people were still heavily traumatized by Nazi rule. Back then, many French people wanted to vent their anger, and since the Nazis were gone, they took revenge on all who had collaborated with them, like the women who had relations with German soldiers during the occupation. In the eyes of the French population, they were considered traitors, even if they had no choice and had worked as cooks, maids, or nurses for the Germans to protect themselves and their families. Those who entered into love affairs with Germans or even had children with them were despised the most. After the war ended, these women faced a cruel fate. Their hair was publicly shaved off, often while an agitated crowd cheered enthusiastically. Afterward, they were chased through the streets, beaten, spat on, and pelted with dirt or excrement. Some women in the ugly carnival even had swastikas burned into their foreheads. In particularly brutal cases, like in Paris, women were simply beaten to death in the street. The ugly carnival was ultimately a bizarre form of vigilante justice, even though police and law and order already existed at the time. Let's continue with a punishment that was completely invisible, but feared by women just as much as physical torture. This was the systematic exclusion of so-called old maids. In the 19th century, especially in England, marriage and having children were considered the central life purpose of a woman. Any woman who was around 30 years old or older and still unmarried was called a spinster, an old maid, a term meant both scornfully and pitifully. But if you think these women only had to deal with insulting remarks, unfortunately it went much further. An old maid was literally excluded from normal society. Some were even hidden away in basements by their own families, and in very religious communities such women were even banished and were forced to live on the street. Marriage was therefore a matter of survival for many women back then, and often had little to do with romantic love. Let's move on to a form of punishment for women that sadly cannot be said to be a thing of the past. That is so-called honor killings. Honor killings are, and never were, punishments in the sense of justice. And yet they are still deeply rooted in the traditions of many cultures, and so, sadly, they remain a grim reality for women worldwide to this day. Honor killings are carried out, for example, because women cheat on their husbands or because they refuse the partner chosen for them. In such cases, women are usually cold-bloodedly eliminated by male relatives who claim to be restoring the family's honor. Next, we come to a punishment device that simply leaves you speechless: the Spanish donkey. This was a kind of wooden beam with a sharp, triangular top edge, on which the punished woman was forced to sit with legs spread. As if the image wasn't painful enough, weights were often tied to her legs to increase the pressure on the beam even more. In addition to the pain, this method was mainly used for public humiliation, since the victims were also usually naked. The punishment targeted, in particular, women accused of adultery or immoral behavior. But one group in particular was punished this way: women who were considered witches. In the so-called witch trials, the Spanish donkey was often used to force women to talk about their alleged magic and how they supposedly cursed people. Next, we move to one of the darkest punishments in history: the Magdalene laundries. These were so-called reform institutions, located within convents and churches, meant to free women from their sin. The women who were sent to these homes were usually prostitutes, women who were unmarried and pregnant, or girls considered troublesome. Even unmarried women over 30 were forcibly admitted simply because they were seen as a threat to married men. In Ireland, single mothers were locked up because an out-of-wedlock pregnancy, no matter the circumstances, was considered a great shame. So it was not uncommon for even underage girls pregnant through sexual assault to be sent there. Although declared as shelters or re-socialization centers, many of these homes were degrading and brutal places. Women were often forced into hard, unpaid labor, usually in laundries, which is why the institutions were sometimes called Magdalene laundries. The women were given a new name upon admission, sometimes even just a number, and were locked up or beaten if they misbehaved. In many places, malnutrition and inhumane sanitary conditions prevailed. Sometimes the women and their illegitimate children were used in vaccine experiments, or the children were taken away after birth and given up for adoption without the mother's consent. If you think this all happened long ago, you'd be wrong, because while the first Magdalene laundries opened back in the 18th century, the last known one in Ireland wasn't closed until 1996. That's why there are still survivors today who are now speaking out and fighting for justice. Next, we come to a punishment that is probably one of the most infamous torture methods of all. We're talking about the so-called pear of anguish. It was a pear-shaped metal device made of several segments that could be spread apart with a screw. It comes from the late Middle Ages or the Renaissance and was used to punish witches or adulteresses. The torture instrument was allegedly inserted into body openings like the mouth or even the intimate area, and then slowly expanded, causing extreme pain and internal injuries. Even jaws were said to have been dislocated with it, and many who were tormented with the pear of anguish were permanently changed afterward, not just physically but especially mentally.